So what's the issue here? What's the issue? How do we boil this all down? The issue, I think, is all about trust, right? So it gets back to trust. To me, if people don't feel like they can trust our industry, that's a big deal. That becomes a big deal. And all this noise that's swirling around feeds into that lack of trust for our industry. Make sense? Trust to me is very specific. It's relationship, it's conversation, it's vulnerability, it's sharing stuff with someone. You're not going to trust me unless you know me more, right? My story about my dad makes you trust me a little bit more because you know me. You know something about me that's very vulnerable. Does that make sense? Trust is not just a word. Trust has meaning. Trust is not something you can hire a PR agency for. You can't pay for it. You can't advertise your way to it. You just can't. You can't put a good ad campaign around it. You can't regulate it. You just can't do those things. Trust has to be built brick by brick, person to person, relationship, one relationship at a time. Tracking with me? Does that make some sense? We talk about transparency, but to me, transparency is the how. Transparency is a how to get to the what, which is trust. Our objective is trust. Make sense? So let's talk a little bit about transparency. 3 years ago at this show, it might have been on this very stage, I did a 10-minute speech and introduced the concept of big T transparency. I talked about the fringe. I talked about the fact that a self-regulated industry is always going to have trouble building trust. It's very difficult from a supplement standpoint, if you're self-regulated, to get the trust needed from the consumer. You have to work harder to get that trust if you're self-regulated, and I firmly believe that. And I made some promises during that speech that I'll cover and see how we're doing since the speech. But it's interesting, I gave this a similar speech to this in July, and on the day I gave the speech, I opened up my Google Alerts on transparency, and there was an article in Forbes. And the article in Forbes is called "Why Transparency Should Matter to Food and Beverage Companies." So it was in Forbes. And I really want to read this to you, and if you'll just hang with me, I think it's really important. There's 4 things that they talk about creates transparency. And the first thing they talk about was transparency speaks to consumer desire for connectedness. Transparency speaks to consumer desire for connectedness, authenticity, and control in an increasingly complex and competitive consumer landscape of buy me and Me Too products and services. Does that make sense? So transparency allows for connectedness, authenticity, right? A linkage back to the company. The next thing it said is transparency reveals product quality. Reveals product quality and the consumer benefit of that transparency. And it shows company integrity, how the company does business. Right? Tracking, that makes sense. Transparency enables consumers to make intentional choices based on easy access to relevant and truthful information about products, ingredients, sourcing, and business practices. And last but not least, transparency creates a stickiness that transforms a transactional exchange into a brand relationship, a reason to buy and repeat buy, willingness to pay more and forgive. Evangelism creates a stickiness that allows for people to forgive. None of us are perfect. There's not a company in this room that's perfect. We all make mistakes. If you've got that relationship that builds trust through transparency, there's a willingness to forgive that most companies just don't get. Does that make sense? I thought that was an excellent example of transparency and what it means.